It was in the middle of World War II. There were 1,500 passengers packed in a cattle car that could reasonably have held about 200. They were making their way to an unknown destination. Had no idea where they were going. Some of them were looking out the slits of the cattle car and they saw the sign. The sign explained to them that they were headed straight to Auschwitz. Of course, there was a collective gasp. They had understood and known what was going on at this particular concentration camp. And when they got there, they were allowed at that time to have one piece of luggage and the clothes that were on their back. But as they filed off of that car, they were instructed to put their one piece of luggage down all in a pile and to shed their clothes and put them in another pile. They had even taken their names from them. No longer did these people have names. They were given numbers. And this particular individual who was telling the story was number 119,104. And he remarked that they had taken everything from these people, had even taken their names. And he said there was a soldier that was standing at the fork of the line where he would wave some people off to the left, others off to the right. And he said he remembered as he was watching that the soldier seemed almost bored with the whole thing. There was no emotion, no feeling in what he did, and most of the people he waved off to the left, but every now and then, almost bored, he said he would wave somebody off to the right. Prisoner 119,104 was waved to the right. The line was much smaller. There were very few of them that actually moved to the right. It looked like the ones that were physically more healthy, and they were taken into a shower, and of course they didn't know what was going to come out of the faucet or the head of that shower, but in this particular case it was water. They were bathed and then given, well, you couldn't call it a uniform, but a standard issue piece of clothing that they then went into the barracks to become part of the workforce. He said that night there was a brave camp inmate who had snuck out of his barracks and came over to tell the people what they needed to do to survive at Auschwitz. He said this guy got all the men together and he started giving them some advice about how they needed to shave, make sure that they were clean shaven, even if they had to take a piece of glass and scrape their face because it would make them look healthier. And he said, it's not as bad as some people have been told. And he said, in fact, most all of you will live. He said, except you. He said, you don't look like you're going to make it. You're just not healthy enough. And he pointed to prisoner 119,104. He said, you just aren't going to have the body. You're not going to have the force. You're not going to have the health to make it. Well, of course, the irony of that was that prisoner 119,104 was one of the very few that did make it alive through the concentration camp and ultimately through the entirety of the war. And he came out and he wrote a book. It's a book that several of you may have even read. You might be familiar with the name of Viktor Frankl. And in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he made one of the most profound statements that I think all of us at a gut level, deep down, we recognize as true. He said when they were taking us through the concentration camps and they were taking our luggage, they were taking our clothes, and they were even taking our names. He said they could take everything from us except one thing. He said the one thing that they could not take from us was our ability to choose our attitude in any circumstance we were in. He said that is the spiritual freedom that no one can take from you, and it's the thing that gives meaning to your life. The ability to choose your attitude no matter what the circumstance. And what I think you and I all recognize is that the people that we see as true workplace heroes, the people that we see as people that we want to emulate, the people that we see as people we appreciate, and we come to work and we might know something's going on in their family or in their world, but they still choose to have an attitude that is, it's positive, it's infectious, it's enthusiastic, it's an attitude from a person that you know they could have chosen different, but they've chosen to bring light and joy to the world regardless of the circumstances they're in. And so I'd just like to ask you, and I'd like to challenge you to remember this truth. It was interesting that Viktor Frankl said there were lots of people that were much healthier than he was. In fact, he said he was a psychologist as he was in the concentration camps, and he said, I started doing a study. Of course, he didn't have anything to record as data, anything like that, but he started seeing why some people stayed alive and why some people didn't. And he said, what I found so interesting about why the bulk of the people who stayed alive did and the ones who didn't stay alive, many times why they didn't, he said it had nothing to do with their health, nothing to do with their physical frame, nothing to do with how much food they were given. In fact, he said lots of the people who lived would even give their food away. He said the thing that separated the group of people who lived and the group of people who didn't most of the time was that the people who lived had a psychological reason to stay alive. In essence, he said they chose to live. You know, the Proverbs writer said something along those lines. He said that a man's spirit will uphold him in sickness, but who can withstand or who can bear up under a broken spirit? And so the challenge to us is simply to choose to have the kind of attitude and the kind of mental approach to life that is not based on our physical circumstances. You know, it's kind of like the twins. There were two twins and their parents. Well, the parents just didn't really know how these two twins ended up being the way that they were. One of the twins, he was happy about everything. It didn't matter what was going on. He was going to look on the bright side. Didn't matter how bad his situation was. He could always find something good in his life. And the other twin, didn't matter what good he had. He was always going to look on the negative side of it. Didn't matter how much blessing or whatever came his way. He was always going to find something negative about it. And so the parents decided they were going to do an experiment. And they took that one negative twin and they took him up to a room, had everything that you would want for a kid. Had video games, had cake, candy, a toy train, stuff to play with. And they were going to leave him there for a couple hours. When they took that other positive thinking twin and they put him in a room full of horse manure. That was it. A room about 2 or 3 times this size. All it had was horse manure in it up to his waist, just horse manure. Left him in there for a couple hours. They waited a couple hours and they went back to the one twin's room where he had everything, had all the toys, had all the video games, everything he wanted. And they opened the door and they called him and he came to the door and they expected him to be excited and happy. He had just been given everything that a kid could want. He mopes to the door and they say, what's the problem? He said, I'm ready to get out of this place. And they said, you're ready to get out of this place? It had everything we thought you could possibly want. He said, the cake had too much frosting, about made me sick. He said, I tried to play with the toy train and it would fly off the tracks because it wouldn't go as fast as I wanted. He said, I couldn't get past level 3 in the video game and I'm ready to get out of here. It's ridiculous. They thought, what in the world is our other son in the room full of manure going to do? So they go down to the other son. He's in his room full of manure. And they open the door and they just see manure flying up in the air and they hear their son laughing. And they think, what in the world is going on? So they call him. He's got manure all over him, got a big smile on his face. And they say, you've been in a room full of horse manure for 2 hours. How can you be happy? He said, oh, well, I figured with this much horse manure in here, there had to be a pony in here somewhere and I was going to find it. Hey, that's the way to look on the bright side, isn't it? You know, it's kind of like old Zig Ziglar used to say that there are some people, when the bottom of the soles of their shoes wear out, they just feel like they're back on their feet. There's some people that if they're going to go fishing or whaling for Moby Dick, they take the tartar sauce along with them because they expect their adventure to be that successful. And the question is, are you a person that chooses to be happy in your circumstances? You know, the fact of the matter is, whatever you focus on gets bigger. If you want to focus on the negative, you can. If you want to find something about what's going on in your life that isn't exactly right, that you wish was different, that you can't believe it goes, you can do that. But if you wanted to focus on the positive, you could do that too. And the more you focus on that positive, the bigger and brighter and better it will get, and the bigger and brighter and better influence you'll have on the people around you. You probably maybe have read the book. I don't know if you have or not. It's brand new. It's a book that was written by a man named Jim Bradford. It's called The Awakening of H.K. Derryberry. And Jim Bradford was a very successful salesman. He one day went into a Mrs. Winters chicken place. And as he was walking in the Mrs. Winters chicken restaurant there, he looked, and there was a young man who was about 9 years old, and he was hunched over at a table listening to a radio. And he could tell there was something interesting about this young man. And he sat and he watched for a little while, and the young man didn't go anywhere. And obviously there was something different about him, and he realized that he was blind. This young man couldn't see. And so he sat there and he drank his 25-cent cup of coffee at the time, and he waited for something to happen with this young man, and he didn't go anywhere. So he went up to the cash register, and he asked the lady, he said, "What's the deal? What's the situation with this?" He was 9 years old at the time, this little boy was. And she said, "Oh, well, that is H.K. And his grandmother works here on Saturdays, and he spends 9 hours a day right there in that booth every Saturday." And he said, "He spends 9 hours in that booth every single Saturday?" And she said, "Yeah, his grandmother doesn't have anywhere to take him, and that's where he spends his Saturdays." So he sat down, started talking to H.K., and H.K. could hardly carry on a conversation. He hadn't had much personal interaction at 9 years old. He was blind, and he had cerebral palsy, and there were several other things that had happened to H.K. H.K. had been born about 90 days early. And I think he weighed about 2 pounds at his birth, and because of the oxygen incubator that they had to put him in, he had lost his vision, and he had several problems with his lungs, and he had to have inhalers twice a day. And to make a long story short, Jim Bradford started spending his Saturdays with H.K. and then started taking him to various different places and giving him opportunities, and H.K. Derryberry became one of the very few people in the world that was diagnosed with something called hyperthymesia. Hyperthymesia is a mental capacity to never forget anything that you ever do. Well, ultimately, even with his cerebral palsy and his blindness, Jim Bradford took him on several adventures. He was able to fly an airplane, to pilot a boat, and did several things. Of course, he had a little help along the way, but he became a public speaker. He would speak to different groups, and he was invited to go speak to the Freed-Hardeman Lions as they were going to be playing the Division I David Lipscomb Bisons. And he stood up, and one of his legs was much shorter than his other leg. He had a limp, and he was blind, and he said, "I love basketball. Never been able to play like you guys have been able to play because I've got some what people call disabilities." But he said, I want to quote Olympic medalist Scott Hamilton, who said, "The only true disability is a negative attitude." And H.K. Derryberry said, "I've been able to ride a horse. I've been able to fly a plane. I've been able to speak to audiences all over the world with my disabilities." And he said, don't let a negative attitude be your disability. You know, the father of modern psychology, William James, said, the greatest discovery of our century is that we can choose what we think. Abe Lincoln said, a man or woman is about as happy as he chooses to be. The question to us simply is, will we choose a positive attitude that will make our world and the world around us a better place? Robert Frost had a very famous poem that I think encapsulates this idea well. The road less traveled. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. I stared down one as long as I could to where it bent into the undergrowth. And I chose the other, that's just as fair, and having perhaps a greater claim. Both were grassy and wanted wear, but as for that, the passing there had yielded them both about the same. Both that morning equally lay, and leaves no steps had trodden black. Well, I saved the first for another day, but knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I chose the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. Well, I'm convinced that when you choose an attitude of kindness and positiveness and beauty, that will make all the difference in your life, in the lives of those around you, in the lives of the institutions of which you are a part, and ultimately in your eternal life. Let's choose that road that's less traveled. Thank you very much.